All right. Hi there, everybody. My name's Matthew Saunders, and I'm going to start by saying everything that I'm talking about today is my own words. It doesn't have anything to do with my employer. Maybe it does, but not officially, right? So I want you to take that with a grain of salt. The other thing to say is I'm not a mental health professional. I'm a digital technologist. So the things that I talk about really come from my own lived experience, and they come from books that I've read and people that I've interviewed and so forth. So, like I said, take that with a grain of salt. All right. Like Gabe said, I've been part of the Drupal community since 2006. I attended my first DrupalCon in 2007. I've been to 25 DrupalCons, and I'm one of the founders of this camp. I sat on the Drupal Association Board of Directors for 2.5 years, and I helped the event organizers working group come into existence, and I sat on that committee for a couple of years as well. I'm one of the founders and currently the chair for Drupal Colorado Incorporated, the company that runs this camp each year. And you should expect, if you made a donation, you should expect to get a tax receipt in your email because we are a 501c3 and we're tax exempt for that. And we're allowed to give those receipts out. My day job is working for Pfizer as in the chief marketing office as a director. I'm specifically working in business process analysis. Prior to that role at Pfizer, I was one of the lead engineers for one of the largest platforms that the company runs. I helped found at Pfizer the Neurodiversity Colleague Community Group, and I'm a host for a podcast there called The Rabbit Hole for obvious reasons. And I'm currently a mentor with Next for Autism. I also sit on their advisory board. Next is an awesome organization that works with professionals who are on the spectrum, helping them live in a neurotypical world and navigate through that neurotypical world. Really recommend that you take a peek at their website. They do everything from grant making to mentoring to helping organizations do planning and so forth. So I'm really proud to be associated with that group. I'm going to start by saying I am not broken. I don't need to be fixed. But I did know since I was small that I was different. And back then, we didn't call it neurodivergence. Back then, it was called learning disabled. We didn't call it. We didn't have the words learning differences. And my disabilities were serious enough that I was legally entitled to accommodations from the Canadian and Quebec, Ontario governments where I lived at the time. In 2019, I began this public journey as an advocate for neurodivergent people by presenting at DrupalCon Amsterdam. That session, I told my story about being a neurodivergent person navigating in a neurotypical world. I'd spent quite a few years at that point researching my daughter's own challenges. We adopted her from social services, and she had all kinds of issues of her own. And for me to be her advocate, I needed to understand what those challenges were. And what happened during that period of time was light bulbs going off in my own head going, oh my gosh, that's me. Oh, that's me. Oh, jeepers, that's me. And in a very real way, if it hadn't been for my daughter, I would have just continued barely coping, and I never would have understood my own ADHD and dyslexia. And I certainly wouldn't have come to the explosive realization that I was on the autism spectrum. And for me, most of my coping mechanisms I learned by the time I went to university in 1989. But nobody was able to tell me why I was different. Some of my coping mechanisms I didn't start building until the year 2000 when I had cancer, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in this presentation. But my personal epiphanies really truly started in 2005, and they continue every single day today as I continue researching and reflecting and refining my own self-understanding. Now, I'm really lucky because my parents saved many of the diagnostic documents that were put together in the 1970s and 1980s. So now what this practically means is I can go through these documents and I can filter those documents with the lens of 21st century's understanding of mental health morbidities. I also want to say, like I said at the beginning, this is my lived experience. I'm sharing insights into what's worked for me and where my problems have been, where my struggles have been. And while there are recognizable patterns for folks who are neurodivergent, every single one of us is different. That said, what I'm going to do is try to generalize my observations. And using this filter, I'm going to also talk about universal design and how that can be feathered into your own lives and workplaces. So let's start with what is neurodiversity. Harvard Health Publishing writes, neurodiversity describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. And there's no right way of thinking, learning, and behaving. And differences are not to be viewed as deficits. So when we talk about a spectrum, we're literally talking about the vast varieties, the way we are. In fact, when you get teams that are mixed with neurodiverse and neurotypical people, those teams tend to be the highest functioning teams out there. So when I talk about these differences, I will typically approach them from a strengths-based lens rather than a focus on deficits. So I want you to imagine, if you will, right now, that you're in a shopping mall. I actually really hate shopping malls, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But let's say that you're walking in a shopping mall. Up to 1 in 5 people that you meet may be living in a world that is defined by systemic exclusion from opportunities to be a productive member of society. Our social infrastructure of customs, habits, institutional protocols, and technologies creates a society that can be hostile to folks who are autistic, ADDers, dyslexic, dyspraxic, synesthete, and hyperlexic, dyscalculic, and a host of other cognitive differences. In fact, 30 to 40% of neurodivergent people and up to 85% of those who are on the autism spectrum who are college graduates struggle with under and unemployment. So we're going to do an activity here. And if you feel uncomfortable with it, that's okay. If everybody just pull out your phones and scan that QR code. And there's a little survey there. It's going to ask you 5 questions in the survey. Just choose one of them. And exclude me. I'm not to be exclude me. I'm not to be one of the people that you're thinking about here. So the questions are you neurodivergent? Do you have a family member who's neurodivergent? Do you have a neurodivergent friend? Do you work with somebody who's neurodivergent? Or are you not sure or don't know anyone? Except, like I said, obviously me, because we don't want to skew this this survey entirely, because all of you now know me a little bit at least.
You're missing one or more of the above.
I think of it as it's okay. I just need one. Yeah. All right. So, and I call this exercise "Who Amongst Us?" All right.
One question.
Just one question.
Oh.
All right. We're up to 30 submissions. Give it just one more second. All right, let's take a look at these results. So when we look at this, 9 of you out of all these people say that you don't know anybody, right? So what that means is, practically speaking, you're in a situation as a group where neurodivergence touches you in some way. And for those of you that don't know anybody or you're not sure, I guarantee that it's touching you in some way. I'm just going to go back to my slide here for a second. All right. Swap. Swap. So in a way, this ad hoc survey isn't actually really fair. And that is really because of the industry we're in. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But still, I think what it does is it illustrates to us that the majority of our friends here are connected to that neurodiverse community. And that's really important. So universal design, hands up for folks who know what universal design is. Just a smattering of you? Yeah, okay, good. All right. So universal design is the concept that includes designing products and environments.
Is that a religious concept?
Sure. Dork. Universal design is the concept that involves designing products and environments that are as usable to as many people as possible, regardless of age, size, ability, disability. And the goal is to maximize usability without the need for specialized design or adaptation. And universal design can be used in all kinds of things. It can be applied to buildings, services, tools, learning strategies, physical spaces. It basically focuses on equity in design. So as we go through some of my lived experience, I'd like you to be thinking about universal design and how it applies or really didn't. And I promise you, as we go through some of these lived experiences, I'll have tons of really poor examples because of the era in which I grew up in. As a child, I was just diagnosed with a reversal problem, with an extremely short attention span, anger issues, inflexibility, and being oppositional. Abrupt noises were and are still painful to me, and I experienced sensory overload easily. It was observed that my visual motor integration was poor. And in the 1970s, there wasn't the vocabulary, the sophistication, or understanding to really define my challenges. So in today's terms, I would have been diagnosed quite differently. Dyslexia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder. And the spectrum now includes what was called Asperger's. Now, I grew up in Canada, and autism wasn't diagnosed there until about 1980. And even so, in 1980, I wouldn't have fit that diagnosis because it was used to describe significant deficits. And Asperger's wasn't recognized in Canada until the 1990s. At that point, I was out of high school. I was on to university. And I would add that when you've got multiple disorders, comorbidity can make it really difficult to identify what causes what. And a few years ago, one of my favorite mental health professionals said to me, it often doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. It's more important to treat the recognizable symptoms. That goes right back to the whole notion of universal design. This is important because what will help neurodiverse people also will help neurotypical people. It's the center and essence of universal design. As a side note, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, no longer recognizes autism spectrum disorder. It was taken out in 2013. And I think this is partially because it was discovered that Dr. Asperger, that was named after, played a critical role in identifying children with disabilities during the racial hygiene measures of the Third Reich. Many children were sent to Spiegelgrund in Vienna, where they were sometimes euthanized or used as subjects for experiments. And that association has been pretty upsetting to some members of this community. That said, many folks in the autism community also were highly suspicious of the diagnosis being wrapped into autism because of the significant negative connotation of deficit. And we all now know that that's not true. It's a different way of thinking, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a deficit. And for many, their diagnosis has become a significant part of their own identity. And just as pronouns can be deeply personal, so can a person's neurodiversity. So if someone shares with you that they're neurodivergent and they describe it as Asperger's, be sensitive to that and refer to it in that way with that person, because that's how they identify. Likewise, if they share that they're on the spectrum, there's a good chance that they don't identify with the label Asperger's. So be sensitive to that. When I was 3, I had a little red tricycle that I just adored. And I would beg my parents to help me onto the saddle. And once I was sitting on that trike, I would just sit and scream and scream and scream and scream. My parents couldn't figure out why I would just sit there and holler at the top of my lungs. It took me over a year to learn to ride a tricycle. Now, in 1977, I was identified educationally as a high-risk child due to delays in eye-hand coordination, spatial relations, motor skills, and visual memory. And this is the reason that I would sit and scream. I couldn't figure out how to move the front wheel. Now, the point of this is that people on the spectrum can anger quickly, and they can have a real difficulty calming themselves. We need to learn skills to cope with that increase in irritability. But first, we must be able to identify these emotions. So I'm just going to talk about the trike here from the universal design standpoint. In his personal note, that trike was a menace to me, right? Even though I loved it. Dr. Kelly Blankenship and Dr. Noha F. Minashaki of the National Library of Medicine wrote, individuals with high-functioning ASDs also exhibit difficulty modulating their anger, which may lead to further difficulties in their social interactions because they have difficulty interpreting their own subtle changes in emotion, and they are often only able to describe emotional extremes. I simply couldn't express my frustration in what would be considered a normal way. This led to extreme outbursts. My emotions seemed to be either elated or they seemed to be extremely angry. There didn't seem to be very much in between. And this would continue well into my teenage years. I had very few friends because they couldn't identify with me. And as a young boy, I would often get into verbal and sometimes physical altercations, even though I was a very small person. And I would become enraged if I felt I was being wronged or insulted, or I thought other people were being wronged or insulted. Children are cruel, though. And rather than trying to help me calm down, they found it very funny to just keep winding me up until I was a complete mess. Then in grades 7 and 8, in an attempt to sort out my learning difficulties, but also to cater to my intelligence, I ended up being enrolled in both the gifted and the remedial program at the same time. This meant I didn't fit in anywhere. The kids in the gifted program, well, I was in the remedial program. The kids in the remedial program, oh my gosh, he must be some kind of brainiac, right? And then the kids in the rest of the school, well, I didn't fit in anywhere. It was an extremely lonely time, and that ran all the way through high school. This had social impacts of its own that really didn't resolve until I got to university. However, one thing I will say is that it saved me from being relegated solely to the remedial program, and this strategy quite likely saved me from a life of being dependent on others. As I got older, I was baffled about how people reacted to me, and I really wanted to figure out why I had trouble making and keeping friends. And what worked for me ultimately was in the moment journaling. So between the ages of about 18 and 20, I carried a notebook around with me everywhere that I went. And when I found myself feeling angry, sad, excited, or happy, I would stop, I would take a deep breath and identify where those emotions were coming from. And I would journal in the moment, and that helped me start to understand cause and effect. I needed to pinpoint why I felt angry, why I felt happy, why I felt sad. So in that last 2 years before I went to university, I started identifying self-destructive behaviors around other people, what those actually looked like, and I began short-circuiting them using reason rather than instinct. The social impact of being an experiment of mixing remedial and gifted programs was on its way to resolving itself mostly when I attended university. Because when I arrived, nobody knew who I was. I realized that I could completely reimagine myself without stigmas that had built up between middle and high school. At Bishop's University, I learned that you can define your own identity. I learned that when redefining yourself, you can fake it until you make it. That exercise in writing down what I was feeling, when, and why allowed me to flourish academically and socially during this time. And people liked me. And it was the first time in my life. I would note that these feelings of anger that I talked about earlier are nearly never directed personally at somebody. It's just something that happens. And they fade very quickly. I don't have any animosity towards people that anger might have been seemingly directed towards, but this can be really confusing for people. They can, particularly for the other person, because they don't understand how somebody can have 180'd so quickly. And for a person like me, person on the spectrum, it's also really confusing because I don't understand, why is it that you're holding on to this? It's all over, it's done. So keep that in mind when you're working with people who are neurodivergent. So to this day, my emotions are still extreme, and I use a variety of self-soothing techniques to smooth things out inwardly and outwardly. And sometimes that manifests as box breathing. I'll talk about that in a bit. Light tapping on the opposite shoulders. Sometimes it's repetitive movements. Sometimes I use a fidget. There are all kinds of things that I do in the moment in order to keep myself sort of centered and regulated. When you work with those on the spectrum, please consider their feelings can manifest differently than your own. They may feel deeply about things that you don't expect them to feel deeply about. And I think that it's really important to avoid approaching this as overreaction, because that just makes things more challenging for us. But none of that makes those feelings any less valid or real. For me, I've found that if somebody asks me, hey, what's up? What are you feeling? Why do you feel that way? I'm happy to talk about these things as long as the feeling isn't being dismissed. So if you're in the long-term personal or professional relationship with somebody who's neurodivergent, learn what triggers them and what's likely to lead to extremes. You can help an awful lot just by understanding and helping a person adapt at home or the workplace. Universal design would encourage workplaces to allow for remote work or hybrid work, or rooms where a person can isolate in the quiet, perhaps lower lighting, or perhaps they can provide things like noise-canceling headphones. But I experience the same extremes in emotion on the other end, too, joy. The Asperger Autism Network writes, many feelings such as fear, anger, joy seem to be experienced more intensely by those with Asperger profiles than average people. In addition, some individuals with Asperger's profiles report that they deeply internalize other people's feelings. So if someone else is upset, they themselves will quickly become upset as well. I feel joy unbelievably deeply, and I think that that's a gift. I remember when I was a young boy, I sang in a choir, and I had the opportunity to sing in places like St. John the Divine. And the experience of being in that space where the echo is a 7-second echo, it just absolutely filled me with joy. When I visited Coventry Cathedral, the juxtaposition between the bombed out church in the Blitz and the new building that had been purposefully built in integration with the old, I was brought nearly to tears. I've been to 2 DrupalCons in Barcelona, and at both times, the La Merced festival was happening. And this is a crazy thing where there's street level fireworks everywhere, dragons with fireworks coming out their noses, drumming going on like crazy. And it was like I was absorbing joy directly from the sparks on the street level. Although both times I went to that, I had to leave early because the stimulus became too great. And actually, I was at one of them with that guy right there. And recently I've become certified as a scuba diver, and this has bordered on an obsession, if I'm honest. And obsession is actually pretty common for people on the spectrum. I feel pure joy when I'm underwater. The pressure pushing in on my body is like a full body weight blanket. And the silence, except for my own inhaling and exhaling through the regulator, is unbelievably peaceful. And then finally, the fact that there's a common sign language that everybody in the world uses. It makes everything clear. All intentions are clear. Autistic people often show affection by sharing their special interests with others, and will explain these passions in great detail. They'll often invite those who they care about to participate in these activities. So if you have a friend who's bubbling with excitement and sharing with you something esoteric, it could be that they simply just really like you and they really want you to share the joy they're having. As a child, it was observed that I had a massive vocabulary, excellent word discrimination compared to others in my age group. My verbal IQ was 98.8 percentile, and my overall IQ was in the 98th percentile. However, traditional learning failed me. Nobody knew how to teach me. It was recommended that you treat Matthew as if he was hard of hearing and maintain eye contact while giving oral instructions. Eye contact? Are you freaking nuts? That was probably the worst thing that they could do. And his attention span is so short, he's so easily distracted that it's possible for him not to hear or retain oral lessons. But here's the thing. They were wrong. If you were to sit me down in a concert or a Broadway show or an operetta or a play, I would sit quietly until the end of the show, consuming everything. And I could repeat back exactly what had happened. There was no doubt that I could concentrate. I was able to pay attention, but not in the way a traditional classroom wanted me to. My mind was quick to sort out a problem, but I could only focus on one thing at a time, and it was often obsessive, especially if it was something that I was interested in. My handwriting was atrocious. I would scramble letters up, and I had a hard time writing letters in the correct direction. And at that time, my parents were told that they should prepare for the fact that I might never learn to read or write. However, that report of an extremely short attention span wasn't entirely correct. I needed the proper motivation. And the obsessive behaviors that can come with those on the autism spectrum when something's interesting made that literacy prediction false. You see, my siblings and father were part of a choir, and I desperately wanted to be part of that. So I was in second grade. I couldn't read yet. And under normal circumstances, children in second grade should be able to read 50 to 90 words per minute. The choir master had me try to read from a hymn book. I just couldn't do it. He told me until I could read, I wouldn't be able to join the choir. And I was inconsolable. I felt stupid and I felt left out. And this turned into fury. It was a red tricycle moment. And initially, my parents saw this as just being an oppositional behavior. But it occurred to my mother that they needed to steer that frustration towards something more productive. I was fortunate because my dad was an English teacher and my mother was a nurse. My dad sat down with me every night, writing letters, words, then short sentences, longer sentences, and eventually short stories on the back of used dot matrix paper. And for you that are close to my age range, I bet you can hear this slide. We spent 2 months or so every night after supper drilling, and mom and dad would find me drilling on my own and often having to force me to go to bed crying because I didn't want to stop. 10 weeks later, I went back to the choir master and asked him to test me again. He was incredulous because I'd done so badly before. After the test, he just looked at me and said, I guess you should join the choir. I'd learned to read in less than 70 days, and not only that, I was reading above grade level in both speed and comprehension. This is known as repetitive obsession. Those on the spectrum who find something interesting can often learn that thing very quickly if motivated. If you're on the spectrum and you have a task that you're not particularly interested in, something that works well for me is I'll change the rules on the task and I'll turn it into a game. So for example, if I'm looking at a spreadsheet and I'm just absolutely dead bored about the data on the spreadsheet, I'll start to create pivot tables that specifically manipulate the data in different ways in order to turn it into a game. So when you're working with somebody on the spectrum who's young, old, or in between, a good tactic is to find out what amuses them, challenges them, interests them, and then they can excel under those circumstances. So here's a life hack, and not just for people who are neurodiverse. If a task is proving difficult to complete, just look at a way that you can make that task different in a way that it amuses you. I had behavioral issues that included some pretty angry outbreaks. I've got Daleks up here because, they get pretty angry, right? In retrospect, I realized that I was having significant challenges with transitions. I'm irritated by unexpected change. And when I feel myself tensing up and I can recognize that fight or flight response occurring in something as unassuming as my wife asking, "Can I use your car?" Or we're changing the order in which we're doing shopping. Or somebody making a completely unexpected change request at work. All these things are highly triggering for me. So what I do is I box breathe and I ask myself, is this a crisis? Is this actually a problem? What are the implications if I push back? And before I started engaging in that strategy, my first response would be to argue, which had negative professional and personal impacts. But this actually never came from trying to be oppositional or difficult. So I'd like to talk a little bit about box breathing because it's a tool that can be useful to anybody. So everybody just close your eyes. And what I'd like you to do is take a breath in and hold that, take that breath in for 4 seconds, and then hold that breath for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds, and hold that exhalation for 4 seconds, and repeat. Box breathing will immediately start to lower your blood pressure. Your heart rate decreases, and you can start to become much calmer. It's even taught to the Navy SEALs as a calming technique. You can open your eyes now. It decreases physical stress hormones in the body, like cortisol. And it's been shown that after deep breathing, not only do participants have these lower levels of cortisol, they have increased attention levels. It's been found that box breathing is useful in the reduction of anxiety, depression, and stress. And this brings me right back to universal design, because this technique can be used by anyone. So if you work or live with somebody who's neurodiverse and you see the fight or flight response on what seems like it should be just a simple thing, take a deep breath and ask the person, "Hey, what am I missing? Help me understand the risk here." And the moment you do that, you've shifted the context of the conversation. Your friend, colleague, or partner might well go into solutioning rather than defending, explaining rather than fighting. Now, I will say that this is my personal experience. But the point of this is you really should be using empathy in these circumstances. And that brings me to this whole notion that those on the autism spectrum don't have empathy. There's this myth. It's entirely untrue. Dr. Maureen Dunn, in her book, The Neurodiversity Edge, cites a study done on cultural differences and those on the spectrum. So researchers made an astonishing discovery. What they found was that those on the spectrum more closely empathized with others on the spectrum. Now, the reason that this is really important is because it's closely aligned to misunderstandings that can arise from cultural mismatches. As an example, take a person from New York City, drop them in a village in Malawi. Both countries, they're English speakers, but that person is going to have a very much harder time engaging in empathy with the people that they've been embedded with. And those people will have a harder time empathizing with the New Yorker that's just been dropped in there. It's not that it's not possible, but you have to work at it. So that person would have to work harder, and the people that person is with would need to work harder. And that's one of the reasons that culture exchanges with kids in high school are so useful, because their brains are still growing, and it can cause a person to grow in just fantastic ways. The same is true when neurotypical and neurodivergent people interact. You have to work on the empathy, but I promise you, it is worth it. Dr. Marcia Eckert wrote on the Asperger's 101 site, before schools and parents and families label behaviors as oppositional defiant disorder, they need to explore thinking of the child involved. Though certain explanations of behavior might seem to be intuitive to the parent or teacher, this behavior might not be so intuitive to the child with ASD, nonverbal learning disorder. And ideally, once the teachers and parents get it, they'll be better able to be helpful and provide meaningful explanations and valuable insights instead of creating a negative experience. This takes time, but it is worth it. As a child, I didn't understand consequences. I wasn't good at connecting action A to consequence B, good or bad. I have to think through scenarios so I understand the consequences of my actions. And this happens incredibly quickly, but I have to think about it. I might cycle through a half dozen scenarios in less than a second before I take an action. I've intellectualized these responses rather than having an instinctual recognition. And I never realized until adulthood that most people just naturally extrapolate these things. So learning to do this has been essential to my being able to fit in. And it doesn't mean that I don't understand kindness or decency or goodness. In fact, I'm highly sympathetic to problems of others, and I'm highly eager to please. Names. All right. How many of you have difficulty remembering names? Yeah, almost everybody here, right? So I've never been good with them. I remember faces, I remember places, I remember events, but keeping a person's name in my brain is extremely difficult. If I'm introduced to somebody, 5 minutes later, that name's gone. They jumble up like this picture of name tags. All the names blend into nothing. And this isn't just in my personal and professional relationships. I also have a hard time remembering names in books, movies, TV shows. I see pictures of people in my mind, but that doesn't connect to their name. And there are probably a couple of reasons for that. People with ADD often have a poor working memory. They often have poor short-term memory. And names are a pretty abstract thing. So then you add in that folks who have ADD often have inattentiveness. Names suddenly become almost impossible. So remember when I said testing indicated my attention span was terrible? Learning new names is obviously highly connected to that short-term memory. And the best way for me to remember someone's name is to create a mnemonic device in the moment, associate that person's name with something else, or repeat that person's name over and over and over again. These are very weird things to do when you're first introduced to somebody. Matthew, I'd like you to meet Christy. Hello, Christy. I see the world outside is misty. Christy, Christy, Christy. Christy is misty. Christy backs off slowly away from the crazy man.
It's better than, can I take your picture so I can write down your name?
A little bit. This also can be very awkward when you're asked to introduce somebody. You know that you should know their name. It's completely gone out of your head, and you can't do it. So I plan ahead of social gatherings and meetings. I'll remind myself of all the names of the people that I'm likely to meet. And before cell phones, I would write it down on a piece of paper, throw it in my pocket. But with cell phones, I just put a note. And I list out the names of the people that I'm likely to meet, who I should know the names of. I'll tell you this, stimulus and stress makes this even worse. Names can go completely out of the window in those circumstances, and I can even forget the name of a very close friend. So remember how I was talking about malls earlier? Crowds freak me out. It's just too much stimulus. I get anxious just thinking about going to a mall. I find it exhausting meeting new people, and it's not that I don't like meeting new people. So don't avoid me, right? I like meeting new people, but it's very, very tiring. And it's very difficult for me to figure out how to negotiate these new relationships. So in my case, and with other people who are neurodiverse, just be patient. It's not that we don't want to meet you, not that we don't like you. It's just that it's hard. It's really hard. So if I know I'm going to be a situation like that, I'll often pick one person who I know and trust, and I'll ask them, hey, please keep an eye out for me. I'm uncomfortable and I may need a way out. So a universal design tip. If someone on your team is on the spectrum and they tell you that they're experiencing too much stimulus, believe them. Help them get to a quieter place. Lower lighting can often help. Don't be offended if they can't remember your name. And in terms of the whole universal design, dark, quiet places can be good for everybody. It really behooves workplaces and public places to make them more and more available. All right, time blindness. This is something that can be both a symptom of ADHD and those on the autism spectrum. And when I was about 12, my father was writing to the Ottawa Board of Education trying to get additional help from me. And one of the things that he wrote was, Matthew has no proper sense of time. It took him a very long time to understand yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He has no notion of days, years, months, or even getting somewhere on time. And this is largely still true. I have to go overboard to make sure that I have calendar reminders set up to help me get to places on time. I can't really estimate how long it'll take me to get from point A to point B. So I'll often use a smartphone with maps to figure that out. And then I'll set up multiple alerts on my phone to make sure that I'm doing the right thing at the right time. And having been a remote worker was a huge boon to me because I could frequently just look at my calendar and see what was coming up next. I can struggle with deadlines, so I overcompensate. I'll start a task very early. And when I find something interesting, I can hyper-focus and I might miss meals. And I don't really feel the passage of time, so I'll often look at a clock and say, hey, where did all that time go? On the opposite side, I'm also really easily distracted. So iPads, TVs, phones, all of these can put me off task. And I can find myself where, again, I don't know where the time's gone, and the things that I intended to take care of are now late. So what to do? First of all, wear a watch. Smartwatches are awesome. Set a haptic alarm every hour during the day that you're going to be awake. That will give you a sense, if you don't sense the passage of time properly, that'll give you a sense that time is passing. Have clocks in multiple rooms. Use technology to prompt you, like Siri, Google Home, and Alexa. Use a stopwatch to time tasks that you know you'll do repeatedly. So you intellectualize setting up alerts when you should start to do a task. Then do the math backwards from the deadline to figure out when you should start, and then double that time. My anxiety levels go through the roof when I realize that I'm going to be imminently late for something, and it dysregulates me. And I make mistakes in those times if I don't force myself into self-regulation. Things like finding parking within time constraints can completely unhinge me. If I have a critical set of tasks to complete after I arrive, my cognitive skills can have gone out the window because of that fight or fight response. As a result, I overcompensate in everything. Always plan to be early. In fact, I arrived here at 7:30 this morning. Lucky for me, Randy was down in the coffee shop and we just had a nice catch up. So typically I'll give myself 15 to 30 minutes. And the thing is, if you're always early, you can never be late, right? So give yourself time to self-soothe, collect yourself, observe, is 15 minutes enough? Do we need a half hour? And do you always need to do a certain set of tasks when you arrive in a new place? I do. So plan for all of that. Use your intellect to compensate. When I was little, I also had very little sense of distance. I would run halfway up the front lawn or yard when I saw a car to avoid it. At 12, I was still considered to be a hazard to myself and others because I wasn't good at judging how far something was away. My eye-hand coordination was poor. I didn't have a sense of my own physical space. I still don't really know what a mile is. But back in the 1970s and 80s, nobody possibly could have made a connection between short-sightedness, poor binocular vision, astigmatism, and ADHD because ADHD wasn't a thing yet. So you see, ADD wasn't added to the DSM until 1980, ADHD in 1987. So many of these symptoms for ADD and ADHD are shared by binocular vision dysfunction, lazy eye. This is the lack of ability to properly focus because your eyes are misaligned. So those with ADHD and ADD can present with these symptoms as well. And in the 1970s, I was misdiagnosed with having a lazy eye and wore a patch over one eye to try to fix it. And I wish that I could say, "Arr, I looked like a pirate." But the truth is, I just looked like a dweeb with a sticky patch over my eye. And this is all a long way of saying, just because I was overcompensating, trying to understand the space I occupied, I ended up wearing one of the most tease-worthy monstrosities over one eye. And that was never going to fix anything. One last piece of disconnected data that they couldn't have understood at the time was the fact that I've got astigmatism and I'm red-green colorblind. Arvo Journals reports 33% of the general public has astigmatism. 73% of those on the autism spectrum have it. The National Library of Medicine reports about 8% of males have colorblindness. But then when you look at those on the autism spectrum, that jumps to roughly 30%, over 3.5 times more prevalent. And the medical community didn't make any of these connections until 2017. So for me, I'm directionally blind. I have spatial impairments. I think this is related to my dyslexia. I have troubles with left and right. If someone gives me directions to go north on 1st Street and then travel west on Green Avenue, forget it, I'm lost. I operate best with landmarks. And so giving myself extra time to get to places typically helps with this problem. And the advent of smartphones with maps has also been a blessing to me. Shortly after I moved to Colorado to start my first full-time professional job, I discovered a lump in my left testicle. That lump tripled in size over the space of about 15 days. I needed surgery and chemotherapy. Chemo was pretty painful at times, and to this day, my hearing is affected. I've got neuropathy in my fingertips and permanent tinnitus in both ears. It's okay. It was an equitable trade. It was intense, and I was in the doctor's office taking chemo through a port installed in my chest pretty much every weekday for about 2 months. I bought a work laptop to the clinic, and I spent my days coding. And when I got home, I'd curl up in a little ball, sweating, just miserable. In 2017, the European Association of Urology made a connection between the prevalence of testicular cancer and learning disabilities. The work's lead author, Dr. Marin Ashfar, said, "We found that people with learning disabilities are not only more likely to develop testicular cancer, but they are also far more likely to die from it than the general population. And people with learning difficulties are 4 times more likely to die of testicular cancer than the general population." For me, this was just another data point. And I will say that for me, not associated with that data point, the cancer didn't actually end up being a net negative to me because it represented a step for me to let go of my rigidity. So remember when I talked about my childhood, how I was impulsive, short-tempered at times, often inflexible, obsessed with a single thing, bad with transitions. I could be impatient with people, and I would often quibble about small things. And I found it very, very difficult to let those things go. and it was often a detriment to my personal and professional relationships. But what this experience taught me was the small things don't matter. I learned that holding on to trifles and letting them stress you out was counterproductive, because when you're being treated for something that will 100% kill you otherwise, your perspective can change. But you guys, you don't need to have cancer to learn this lesson. If you're feeling stressed by the small stuff and it causes you to argue with people, it's probably worth taking a deep breath and trying to ascertain to yourself, does it really matter? Will your relationships be better if you breathe or argue? Now, public service announcement. If you are a guy, please do self-checks in the shower regularly. This kind of cancer is very common in young men, but highly curable if you find it early. So, and this is even doubly more important if you have learning differences. When I finished high school, I was not ready to go to university. I wasn't mature enough and I didn't have enough self-awareness. High school had been extraordinarily difficult for me. And while I never failed any classes, I had a hard time concentrating and I was socially extremely awkward. I didn't understand people well. They didn't understand me and I was often bullied. In the 9th grade, I was taped to the football goalposts 2 feet off the ground. Later during high school, my locker was broken into and a snake, a couple of crayfish, and a fetal pig, stinking of formaldehyde, had been left there. The stigma from junior high had followed me, and I was alone, bullied, and largely without a tribe. Every success since then has been colored with, somebody's going to figure out that I'm worthless. This is when imposter syndrome began for me. I felt happiest when I was able to do things on my own, things that required repetitive actions. This meant that I excelled in art classes, where repetitious techniques like cross-hatching were valued. And I was able to express myself in some pretty bizarre ways. And rather than being frowned on for it, I received praise for my creativity. And at the end of high school, I decided, with the help of my parents, to take a vocational art program for high school graduates. I worked in a coffee shop at the same time, but I was really adrift, and neither my parents nor I had any idea of what was next to come. I half-heartedly engaged in that program, and I left it before the year ended. I was deeply sad. I felt like a fake, a fraud, and useless. But my father saw an advertisement in the local newspaper for a tiny liberal arts university in the eastern townships of Quebec. The school is nestled on the convergence of 2 rivers. It was established in 1843 with much of the architecture reflecting its affiliation with Oxford and Cambridge universities. And when we toured the school, it was immediately clear that the school size, only about 1,700 students, was perfect for my needs. I applied in fine arts and theater, was accepted, and I received scholarships. And I couldn't believe it. Like, that seemed crazy to me that I would be getting scholarships. My largest class was about 40 people, and my smallest was about 7. And I started school feeling like a fraud, and I was just waiting for a teacher to call me out, for them to take the scholarships away, for them to tell me that I was no good, for all of it to just fall apart. I was waiting to be bullied. I was waiting to be shamed. But those things didn't happen, and I flourished. High-functioning people with ADD and ADHD can do well in the workplace and school, but undiagnosed, they may have symptoms that could be attributed to anxiety and depression. It can affect self-esteem. You can feel like you have character flaws that can lead to feelings of shame. You can have a lack of confidence. You might get praise for how long and hard you work. But the part of the reason that you're working long, hard hours is to compensate for the inability to stay on task for longer periods of time. This can make you feel like a fraud. It can lead to that feeling someday someone's going to figure out that I'm just faking it. But you're not faking it. You're good enough. I want to talk about masking a little bit. Does everybody, who here knows what masking is? Just a few people? Okay. So most neurodivergent people engage in a thing called masking, and actually everybody does to a certain extent, and you just probably don't know it. But most high-functioning neurodivergent people engage in masking. We model neurotypical behavior to fit in, but it's exhausting. It's something that you have to keep up all the time. You have to be thinking about it all the time. It takes a ton of energy to keep it up. So why do we do it? Well, the first reason is to make other people feel more comfortable around us. And the other thing is to make ourselves feel like we fit in. Now, like I said, it's fair to say, regardless of whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent, engage this at one level or another. You behave differently with your best buddies than you do with your grandmother. But for the neurodiverse, this is exponentially more difficult. If we look back at what I was talking about earlier on in the talk, my first real exercise in this, in consciously masking, was that journaling activity, figuring out what made people more comfortable. I also used the theater portion of my undergrad to practice that masking and to perfect it. This means that for most people who are neurodivergent, who are engaging in masking, aren't actually able to live their full authentic lives. Think about that when you're around folks who are neurodivergent, who are making that effort to make you feel more comfortable. This last story is really general advice. It doesn't apply to those with learning disabilities exclusively. Even so, it's doubly important for us. So after I finished my bachelor's degree, I moved to Ottawa and I worked as a lighting technician for a local theater. And I realized while I was doing that lighting work that I really didn't want to be a theater technician my whole life. So I enrolled in a nonprofit management program at the University of Ottawa, which led to a job at an experimental dance company. I'd also applied to go to grad school in Virginia, and I had been accepted to do a Master of Fine Arts focusing on arts marketing. So the job at the dance company was curious because it represented my first step to becoming a software technologist. I wouldn't be standing here right now if it weren't for working at a dance company. It was 1995, and one of the things I was hired to do was work on their website. And I said, well, sure, yeah, I can do that. But I didn't have Google to Google what is a website. I did know what the internet was because I was using Telnet to log into this crazy system called Lambda Mu, which was a giant freeform multi-user game without actually any reason to the game. It was just a social experiment that Xerox Park had set up. And in fact, I met my wife there. She was here in Colorado. I was in Ontario in Canada. I asked a friend on Lambda Mu, what's this web thing? And he was very helpful and pointed me to some useful information. And suddenly, I was a webmaster. I had no idea what I was doing. Even so, I'm sure that most people were in the same boat, because in 1995, there were a sum total of 23,500 websites in the world. And I bet you most of them were porn. One of the absolutely insane things, though, that the company worked on that summer that I helped with, remember, this is 1995, right? So think back. There were no flat screen TVs, right? There were giant cathode tube things and so forth. There was a collaboration that they set up in real time, multiple dance companies in different cities across Canada, 5 of them. They've been working with a Canadian broadcast company, and they arranged for bidirectional video feeds to all of these different dance companies. And 5 choreographers with 5 dance companies in front of 5 audiences created a piece of work in real time. And it blew me away. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. So when I arrived at Virginia Tech, I explained my experience to my committee, and my committee was incredible and allowed me to gather together a coalition of different departments to experiment with bleeding edge technology for my thesis work and not worry about all that marketing stuff. So rather than researching the arts administration side, I produced 3 multimedia works, each layering on top of the previous one, with the web, imagery, live action theater, streamed live feeds, and pre-recorded videos. I had to learn to code, to manage people, to string together networks, and to learn video codecs. So this boy that was never supposed to learn to read or write had been transformed into a technologist. All of this led to my working with the university after graduating, teaching copyright law, videography, developing the first database-driven tourism website with the Virginia Tourism Board. This was back in 1998. So what I want you to think about it is that you should never be frightened to ask for what you need and what you want. The worst thing that can happen is somebody can say no. Don't be frightened to do crazy and bold things. Do things that take you completely out of your comfort zone. And assume that if you keep applying pressure to it, you will make it work. Be fearless and don't let the perceived consequence of failure cripple you, because the real consequences of success can be life-changing. I was afraid to start talking about my own personal mental health challenges. I was frightened to discuss my learning disabilities. My neurodivergency was something I heavily masked. I didn't want to be different. I didn't want to be perceived as being different. I didn't want my professional career or my personal relationships to be prejudiced or destroyed because of these aspects of myself. When I was a child, I learned through the School of Hard Knocks that I needed to hide this part of me. I needed to put it away in a safe little corner and protect what I thought were dirty little secrets. Becoming a dad changed all of that. I'm coming full circle now, because I had to talk about these things as my daughter's advocate. After a few years of being cleared of cancer, my wife and I decided we wanted to adopt a child. We always knew that we wanted to be parents. And we adopted through the foster care system because so many abandoned children in the US need parents. Also, we don't seem to be able to do anything the easy way. We adopted a 5-year-old girl. She had very difficult few years of her life before she came to us. And in a lot of ways, her challenges mirrored my own mask challenges. I wouldn't understand those challenges if I hadn't been confronted with hers and had to learn everything that I could about reactive attachment disorder, ADHD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and bipolar disorder. If it hadn't been for my daughter, I would have just continued coping, and I never would have understood my own ADHD and dyslexia. I certainly wouldn't have come to the realization that I was on the autism spectrum, and I never, ever would have had the courage to talk about these things publicly. So I have a few last takeaways for you before I pause for questions. It's estimated that 1% of the population has autism spectrum disorder. This is actually an incorrect number now. Recent studies have increased that significantly, but never mind. With software developers, this jumps to 4% of us. Reporting. 4.4% of the population has ADHD, 20% of the population has dyslexia. So high-functioning autists gravitate to industries like software development. It's because we can isolate ourselves. There are very things that we can focus on, we can obsess on. So you have people in your life who, and some of them are masking, you might not know who they are. You've got people in your life who are in this situation. So keeping this in mind, use empathy. If you're on the spectrum, you have to work twice as hard to understand how other people perceive the world. And if you aren't on the spectrum, you need to work twice as hard to help your friend, colleague, or partner. Make patience central to your life. Patience is a muscle that needs to be exercised. Those with ADHD and autism become more irritable more easily than neurotypical people, and that can lead to outbreaks of anger. And practically speaking, this means that if you're neurodivergent, you need to be monitoring why you feel what you do. And if you're neurotypical, help your friend by watching warning signs and triggers. Kindness. Kindness should be your go-to, even if you're feeling upset. Assume people are approaching situations or problems with good intentions unless they prove otherwise. Be kind. Couple of books that folks you might want to read. They're awesome. The Canary Code by Dr. Ludmila Preslova and The Neurodiversity Edge by Maureen Dunn. Some of the material that I talked about today has come from those two books. And this presentation was based on a series of YouTube videos that I've been working on. If you're interested in watching those, bit.ly, my neurodivergent brain will get you there, or you can scan the QR code. And I think I've got time for maybe just a couple of questions if people have questions.